Hi, welcome to the next episode of the Complete Physio Podcast. I'm not Chris Myers, I'm Dave Baker, one of the other clinical directors. And today we are going to be talking about running, particularly talking about running at master's level, so sort of over the age of 40.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. And I'm Alex. I've been on one or two of the other podcasts talking about running. So I'm a physio with a special interest in runners and an England athletics running coach.
So just to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from with this, so I'm 52 years old. I run probably sort of 3-4 times a week, do the occasional park run, do the occasional 10K. So I would class myself as a sort of, a keen recreational runner, not necessarily particularly good, but a keen recreational runner. And I probably have the same sort of like thoughts and ideas and concerns of many people that run in my age group. And I guess my first question to Alex is going to be, is it safe for me to be running?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest question people ask or get asked by friends and family when you say you're running. The common things are, aren't you worried about hips, knees? You're going to get arthritis, going to wear things out. I think the short answer to your question is yes, it is safe to be running. I think there are definitely some caveats to think about, which we can delve into. But in short, it is safe to be running. It's a good exercise. It has been shown to be beneficial on sort of multiple levels. All cause mortality is lower in those that run regularly. Things like heart disease, diabetes, cancers are lower in people that run regularly. So it has huge health benefits. And then the thing that I'm sure you're probably more leaning towards is it going to wear my joints out or things like that, which is the common question. So, and I think over the last decade or so, maybe a bit longer, we've had more and more research emerge that means we can really quite confidently say at this stage that actually those that run on the whole have healthier joints and less arthritis than those that don't run, basically. So, particularly looking at hips and knees, we see there's been some good research where they do prospective studies where they follow people over decades of life and then they x-ray and look for radiographic x-ray signs of arthritis. And they would, on the whole, runners will have about half as much arthritis in knees and hips as sedentary people that don't run. It is, as we were talking about earlier, a U-shaped curve though. So you've got the regular runner like yourself who will have, on the whole, less arthritis. We're not saying no arthritis, but it will be less prevalent versus a sedentary runner who will have more arthritis. And at the other end of the U, the incredibly high sort of high intensity or high amounts of running. So runners that run large amounts or run lots and lots of high intensity. So more elite level runners or potentially elite runners will have higher levels of arthritis than the sort of recreational runner. So yeah, fairly long answer, but the short answer is you are safe to be running.
Okay. And as you know, as a physio, I read the same research, but it'd be really useful, I think, just to explain, if you like, the science and the physiology under those numbers, because it is counterintuitive. We're talking about osteoarthritis, which is essentially wear and tear. So if I'm jogging, surely
Yeah.
I'm creating more wear and tear on my joints. So the intuitive thought would be the more I run, the more wear and tear I'm going to get.
Yeah, it would. And I think that's where societally and anecdotally all those stories have come from. And it's easy to correlate if you've got a bunch of people who are maybe in their 60s and 70s and 80s sat around talking, and some of them have got arthritis and some of them say, oh, well, I used to run a lot. It's easy to potentially draw that line from A to B and say, well, it must have been the running when you were younger that means you've now got arthritis. But we know arthritis is a very complex subject, and the science on that is getting better and better. And it will have you'll have genetic predisposition. Environmental factors will be a trigger. How you live your life, lifestyle, nutrition, exercise levels will absolutely be a factor. With running, the thought process is that yes, running is a mechanical load on the musculoskeletal system. So that includes the joints. But done at a sensible level and done at a regular, consistent level, it has positive mechanical effects on the joint. So it encourages chondral bone to regenerate and to become healthier and thicker. So runners generally have healthier chondral bone, and it's chondral bone that breaks down in arthritis essentially. So actually that mechanical load done consistently can act as a real stimulation for healthier chondral bone, m- more sort of regularly produce synovial fluid, all the things that actually keep joints in a more healthy state than someone who is sedentary and isn't giving that mechanical stimulus to their joint anywhere near. And you have to also remember that if I'm a runner and I'm choosing, and you're a runner, you're choosing to run regularly, there is a link, there is a corollary with that, that you also probably live a healthier lifestyle than someone who runs regularly. You would hope.
One would hope so.
So you probably eat a bit better.
Yeah.
You probably make better decisions about sleep and nutrition. And so
Hmm.
it's not just the running, it's what goes with the runner
Yeah.
versus the sedentary person who maybe has other lifestyle
Yeah.
factors that also contribute to
Yeah.
a less healthy environment for joint health.
For sure, for sure. So I guess what we're saying is we need to change the way we're thinking about the joint, and rather than thinking of it as something that's going to wear out like a bar of soap, we need to think about our joints as a responsive system like muscles. So we wouldn't say, oh, don't go to the gym, you're going to wear your muscles out. We accept the fact that they respond to the exercise and they adapt and they change, and we should probably be applying the same sort of thinking to our joints. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Actually, I think it joints maybe don't have as much of a capability to respond in the same as before, but it's
Yeah.
very similar. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's a great way to think of it. You are stimulating a regenerative response rather than thinking of it as just rubbing joints
Y-
away, which is
Yeah, yeah.
definitely not happening.
Yeah, yeah. So as a runner, we're always thinking about, okay, so if we accept the fact that running actually can stimulate positive change within the joint, and all the research keeps pointing to the fact that running within sort of certain volumes, and certainly if we're not running excessive volumes, then that can actually have a good preserving effect on the joints, and that's obviously excellent for us to think about. The next point that we might think of is how could we further enhance that effect by modification of our running. So I'd really like to talk about what do we know about the best volumes to run, and possibly some steer on the best training regimes.
Yeah, I mean we could talk for a long time on that. I think in terms of, like you said, in terms of putting it into a package for the masters runner, I think the things we do need to understand in that masters runner. So we're talking like those people over 40,
Yep.
um, and it's not that just we go from 39 and 51 weeks and 40 and everything changes physiologically, but that there has to be a cutoff to
Yep.
decide that. I think we know that, and this would be for all ages, but it gets more important as we age, that intensity is probably a big thing to think about. We can't be doing all of our running at high intensities. That's for any runner at any age, but we recover slower as we get a bit older, and our soft tissues take a little bit longer to recover, and our joints take a little bit longer to recover. So every time you exercise, you do load and cause micro trauma to lots of different tissues and structures. And it's important those structures do have the ability, and you give them the environment to recover in before you then load them again. That's the classic paradigm of how someone gets injured, basically. So the number of high intensity sessions in your week probably doesn't need to go over maybe 2 or 3 sessions if you're a masters runner. You might be able to cope with a little bit more than that as a younger runner, especially if
Yep.
you're doing high volumes. Volume's a tricky one to answer because everyone's different. I think
Yep.
that for me would come down to your running age. How
Yep.
long have you been consistently running for?
Yep.
So if you're 52 and you've been running since 22 and you've consistently run for 30 years,
Mm.
your body can tolerate volumes. If you say you've been running 60K a week for 30 years, well, your body's very well adapted to that and it can continue to tolerate that volume. You might naturally drop down a little bit, but it will tolerate that. If you're a new masters runner or a transitioning masters runner, that volume needs to be gradually earned. You've got to
Yep.
build up very gradually. And I think one way to think about it, that we often talk about this 80-20 rule in terms of distributing your running, is to think that, okay, well, I'll build my running up gradually. I'll only include 1 or 2 high intensity sessions a week, and I will ensure that roughly 80% of all my running is at a lower intensity, 20% is in that higher intensity. I think you can apply that rule to any age.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then that over time, and even if you're taking up running in your 40s or 50s, you've still got maybe 20, 30, 40 years of running ahead of you. So
Yep.
you can take your time to build your volume back
Yeah.
up. So yeah, I think they would be training principles without digging into other things we might think about, like strengthening
Yeah,
and
yeah,
things like
yeah.
that.
So when we're talking about high intensity, that 20% that we would do at high intensity, what steer can we give people? What simple way of sort of measuring that, or how would we define, if you like, what is high
Yeah, what
intensity?
constitutes high
Yeah,
intensity? I think you've got a number of options from the basic level of perceived effort. So
yeah,
we use RPE scales, rating
yeah.
of perceived effort. So if you're used to exercising and you feel that you can score your effort out of 10, one being lying on the couch or walking very slowly, 10 being an eyeballs out sprint that you could probably only sustain for 10 or 15 seconds,
Yeah.
everything else is in between. So I would say anything that sort of starts to go to 5 or 6. 5 or 6 is probably a moderate intensity effort, and anything that's a 7 or out of 10 or above is a high intensity effort.
Okay.
That might everyone's got running watches these days, and most of them
Yeah.
have heart rate monitors built in, or you might have an arm strap or a chest strap. That's going to be your sort of zone 4 and 5 heart rate zone if you're using heart rate zones. Important thing to understand with that is you need to make sure you understand where your max heart rate is and that your zones are correct. Um, and then above heart rate zone, you could use things like laboratory testing. So if you're really into your running and it's becoming more readily available, you might go and do a lactate threshold test where
Yeah.
they do bloods while you're running to use markers in your bloodstream to decide to help you understand where you're tipping into a pace that you could sustain for a long time versus a pace where you'll start to use energy systems that aren't derived from oxygen and we can't sustain those for as
Hmm.
long, and that would be your high intensity zone basically. So there's a few tiers you could work
Yeah,
through
yeah,
to
sure. Yeah,
understand.
yeah, yeah. That's really useful, really useful. So we're going to just go back to, we sort of touched on a minute ago about sort of reducing injury risk and things that we can do that potentially might reduce our risk of injury. And we've given some, steer around sort of like those general basic ratios between high intensity versus lower intensity running, and how many of those we should be doing a week, which is, fantastic, really, really useful information for people to incorporate in their running programs. What other things? So, what would you say are the, say, top three most important things that a master's age runner
Yeah.
could do to reduce their risk of injury? What would be the top
Yeah.
three things you would advise?
I think the biggest one probably to talk about, and my bias is strength training,
Yeah,
which we can definitely circle back to. Beyond that, I think for every runner, but it becomes just as important, muscle is getting your recovery right.
yeah,
So I definitely think prioritizing sleep and prioritizing good nutrition and fueling. So sleep and nutrition fueling probably be the other two things. I
yeah,
think they're the things that are still we get wrong at all ages,
yeah,
essentially, especially if you're trying to do more, if you're trying to increase your volume of running, you are burning more fuel and you are causing a little bit more micro trauma that needs repairing after each run. So you need to make sure you're taking on adequate fuel, adequate protein, adequate hydration to transport those molecules around the body, and very easy mistakes to make. And I think when we see injuries, often injuries are a result of an imbalance between load stressing the body and allowing it to adapt and recover. And that's the bit that I think people often get wrong, basically. But even for them, but I think not more importantly, but I think easier to implement than necessarily is to ensure you're supporting your running with some strength training. I
okay.
think.
So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the strength side of things. So again, sort of classic conversations and questions that I get asked and come up on the forums are, look, I'm running 30, 40 Ks a week. Surely all the muscles that I need to run are going to be strong because I'm using them a lot. And the mantra that I always say to clients coming to see me is say that certain muscles that you need to be strong to run, but running doesn't make them strong.
Yeah.
So, can you give us a bit of insight, Alex, on key muscle groups that you would advise for runners to focus on? And also, a bit like you talked about with the nutrition and the monitoring of your running intensity, if you like, the different tiers or that a runner could go through, depending on how much time, resources, and dare I say, money they want to throw at this.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, sure. So, I mean, strength-wise, I think if you look at where masters runners pick up injuries, they're different to younger people. Younger people pick up more bony injuries, and they tend to pick up more sort of yeah, ITB issues, some tendon issues, but and knee pain, kneecap pain, things like that. Masters runners pick up more muscle and tendon issues, absolutely. And one of the reasons for that is as we age, our muscle mass, our ability to produce force, our power, they all naturally decline. We have this thing called sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle mass. And if you're sedentary and doing nothing, you're going to potentially lose around 10% of your muscle mass every decade of life from 40 onwards. And although running is a great stimulus, it's a stimulus for muscular endurance. And one of the things we know is protective for injury, particularly in muscles and tendons, is also to be able to produce is muscle size and that ability to produce force quickly and powerfully, which running doesn't necessarily give you that stimulus. So number one is calves, definitely for the masters runner, because that's where a large number of injuries occur. Calf strains and Achilles problems. They would be probably the two things I see most in the runner over 40. So calves, basically. Get them
Yep.
stronger. And you're saying tiers. So it needs to be, there's no point in you doing sort of reps of 30 calf raises off the edge of a step with just body weight, because that loading is not going to load a muscle in a way that we get either hypertrophy changes or positive tendon adaptation. So we know tendons need heavy, slow loading to change in a positive way. And if we're trying to get hypertrophy, we know we also need heavy, slow loading. So that could look like single leg, full range calf raises off the edge of a step, but with some weight
Yep.
building up to it if you're not used to it, but building up to maybe having a rucksack on the back with 10 kilos in it in books or bottles of
Hmm.
water, and really working in those lower rep ranges of maybe 6 to 8 reps and 3 or 4 sets a couple of times a week. It doesn't need to be every day. A couple of times a week would do it. So calves would be one.
Hmm.
And then if we think about, depending on what type of runner you are, if you're an off-road runner, trail runner, any sort of hills, quads are probably then next. Knee pain and even knee health has been shown to
Yep.
be better if you keep your quads strong. So if
Yep.
we go back to the arthritis conversation, if you want to reduce that risk even further,
Yep.
quad strength. And again, how do we do that? So that could be isolated quads work in the gym on something like a knee extension machine,
Yep.
um, which in the past has been sort of been not an exercise that has been like thought as non-functional, but strong quads are strong quads.
Yep.
Or it could be variations on squats or lunges. But again, I would go back to that principle of making sure it's challenging enough. So it's relatively heavy, it's a relatively slow exercise, and you're in those lower rep ranges, but those rep ranges are challenging. So if you're doing sets of 8, there's no point doing an exercise where you do 8 reps where you have the capacity to do 20 in that set. If you're getting to 8, you should only feel like I maybe had 3 or 4 max good reps left in the tank before I'd need to take a rest, and that would
Mm.
give you an appropriate challenge with the
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Beyond that, I mean, the classic one is lazy glutes in runners. That's probably a bit of a myth that we need to get rid of, but there's nothing wrong with strengthening glutes, hamstrings, and definitely trunk. We tend to find it harder to maintain a good trunk position as we fatigue, and it's an area again that will potentially just gradually get a bit weaker as we age. So doing
Hmm.
some good trunk work alongside that would be useful. That could be done more in the forms of just simple plank work
Yeah.
or things along those lines,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically. So you could put together a program of 4 or 5 exercises.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be that complicated, but a big principle to aim for is that if you need to at least build up to it being heavy and challenging.
Yeah.
If you're not used to doing any strength training, you obviously don't start there. You'd
Yeah.
spend some weeks getting competent at the
Yeah.
exercises and then build up to it being heavy and challenging.
Okay, that's great. So, listen, I want to run for the next 30 or 40 years. Okay, and so I want to make sure that I've optimizing the muscle length and strength relationship as far and wide that's going to give me any sort of value back on the time that I put into it. If I want to know a bit more about any sort of like imbalances or anything of that nature? What's the gold standard? What can we do? How can we sort of do a more scientific approach to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of ways now. Like I said, and again, if we tiered it,
Yeah,
so there's nothing to say you couldn't do some home testing or some
yeah,
gym testing and just have a look at. So calf, if we're looking at the calf, there
yeah,
was Herbert Lozier and his team in 2017 now did calf raise norms. So from an endurance capacity
yeah,
perspective, you can find their numbers online very easily, and we could even put a link somewhere, I'm sure, for it.
yeah,
And you do a single leg calf raise at 1 second up, 1 second down to failure, and then you see where your numbers compare to your age matched norms, age and sex matched norms. So, and there are tests like that that we can do for things like one-legged sit to stands and bridges. So that would be like an entry level strength battery testing, basically. But we're lucky now that we have access to much better ways of potentially testing. So there used to be lab-based tests like isokinetic machines, which are very
yeah,
expensive and they're still very much used for like post-op stuff and things like that. But we have handheld dynamometers these
yeah,
days where we can look at maximal forces that muscles can generate, and we can do really good testing of limb symmetry and have a look. So if you've had injuries in the past, really useful to compare left to right. Have I actually fully got over that injury? Have I restored strength to where it was before? We've got force plates where we can have you doing isometric testing that is very specific to running positions per se, and we can do jump testing and hop testing, and we can have a look at you again compared to age matched norms. We're starting to get more and more normative data, so we can
yeah,
look at a runner and say, okay, how reactive are they off the ground? So something called the reactive strength index, which is something that tells us essentially how springy someone is. And again, we have norms, and if we pick up someone being below those norms, we can give them some more tailored work to do in the gym
yeah,
to hopefully prevent injury, but
yeah,
also to help with performance and to help them, like I said, make sure that longevity is there
yeah.
in their running, really.
Yeah. So I can really, potentially we can get tuned up, as it were, with our muscle length and strength, and there is ways, reasonably easily accessible ways of sort of testing this nowadays, which will give us, that added, as you say, different an upper tier, if you like, in terms of like steer on where to focus our exercise and our training. People that have had injuries when they were younger, so you just sort of touched on that, and I'd like to just talk about this for a moment or two. So if someone's had surgery on their knee, might be 10, 15, 20 years ago, if we're talking about a master's runner, or someone had a bad ankle fracture 10, 15, 20 years ago, do we pick up deficits? Do we pick up changes a long way down the line sometimes in these people?
Yeah, I think you do. If you look at ACL research, you
Yeah,
see even at 2 and 5 years, people have quads deficits and sort of in peak force and in
yeah,
power. Achilles again at 2 and 5 years, people often still particularly weaker in that peak force development. So you do pick them up, and I think it's because there's a difference between getting back to a level where you're functional and you don't necessarily consciously notice something versus getting back to a level where you were before your injury. And there's not necessarily always a huge difference between that. And we don't necessarily know if it is definitely relevant, but if we're sort of wanting to try and cover all bases as much as possible, it can be useful to find out is that. And we certainly do know a few other things as well. We know that the biggest risk factor for a running injury is a previous running injury.
yeah,
So if you've had a more recent injury that you're just getting over, we know that that's often will have meant your volume of running has drastically dropped, maybe even stopped for a while. Your intensity has dropped for a while, and that return to running is challenging.
yeah,
And that window when you're returning to the fitness you want to be at is absolutely when people are more likely to relapse and pick up
yeah,
another injury.
yeah,
And it gets really frustrating. We see lots of runners who are on their third or fourth injury in 2 years.
yeah,
Um, and they say I haven't had a consistent season now for
yeah.
however long. And I think that's sometimes where it's useful to say, well, hold on, let's draw a line in the sand and actually physically look at where you are now,
Hmm.
and have a really good look at what you've been doing with your training. Because I think it will often be one of two things. It will maybe be a physical capacity issue. They haven't restored that capacity to a level it needs to be to tolerate the demands of running, or they have done really well there, but they're just getting their training wrong, and they're being a bit impatient, and they're
Hmm.
trying to build a little bit faster than they would like to, and maybe that's because they are now in their 40s or 50s, and they're basing their training on what they would do in their 30s, and it needs a bit of adaptation,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. And that is, and we'll come on to this a little bit, hopefully a little way later. But there is a bit of a paradox there, isn't there? Because as a 52-year-old runner, I still want to be running faster every year. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to
Yeah.
accept.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to accept that I've gone past my PB and that's never going to improve. I'm not ready to accept the fact that I'm going to be running slower now, year on year on year. Although, if I step back from it, I know I'm going to be running slow when I'm 60, 65, 70 than I am now. It's still very difficult to get my head around the fact that I might reasonably expect to be running a little bit slower year on year. But physiologically, that's probably exactly what we should be expecting. It's a difficult one for older runners, yeah?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think so. What do we know? Physiologically, we know your max heart rate will reduce
Yeah,
by just under a beat per minute every year.
yeah,
Your cardiac output will reduce.
yeah,
Your VO2 max will reduce by about 7% a decade.
yeah.
What does that mean? It
This is
means
hurting me, Alex.
it's yeah. But okay, so the
Yeah.
positives is that's in sedentary people.
Yeah,
So the heart rate is in everyone, but
yeah,
the VO2 max can definitely be offset by
yeah,
regular training. You
yeah.
still will reduce by maybe not, but by not so much. Your cardiac output will reduce, but by not so much. Positively, your peripheral, your ability to get the oxygen into your muscles doesn't reduce if you
Mhm.
train regularly. So as long as you can get that oxygen in,
Yeah,
it will still get to your muscles just as well in your 50s and 60s as it did in
yeah,
your 20s and 30s. And running economy actually doesn't change that much. What happens is the percentage of of our VO2 max we might need to run at to sustain a pace goes up. So it feels perceptively, it feels a lot harder. But
yeah.
actually, the amount of fuel you're using to sustain a pace doesn't change a great deal. Our
Mhm.
stride shortens naturally as we get a bit older, and we lose this calf strength and this term stiffness is
Yeah,
important in
yeah,
running. And it's different to getting up and feeling stiff, can't touch my toes. Stiffness is your sort of your musculotendinous and joints ability to sort of attenuate the
yeah.
forces when you hit the ground. And actually, a stiffer limb is a more efficient limb.
Mhm.
So again, keeping strong can really help offset some of that.
Yeah.
So when you slow down is in part in your hands and in part
Good.
not in your hands,
Yeah,
essentially. How quickly you decline
yeah,
is absolutely in your hands
yeah,
if you train well and sensibly and you try and work on those things around your training. I think that's really important. And you definitely get people who the thing to maybe think about as well is you maybe in your 20s and 30s didn't reach your absolute peak. Not many of us will get to that point where we've reached our physiological
yeah, yeah,
peak. So you might still be able to run faster in your 40s and
yeah,
50s than you ran in your 20s and 30s
yeah,
because you trained better
yeah, yeah.
at that age.
And I think that's borne out in some studies looking at London Marathon, isn't there? The groups that
Yeah.
do really well are actually the older groups, oftentimes, as opposed to the younger runners. So maybe there's less distractions when you get
Well,
older.
I think that definitely happens. Like if you think in your, unless you were a really serious club runner, you
Yeah,
probably didn't get to your peak in your
yeah,
teens and 20s, probably.
yeah,
Um, and then late 20s, 30s, your ability to train well for
yeah,
most is impeded by work, social life, family
yeah,
life. So actually, when you start to become that master runner, and actually the kids are growing up, like my kids don't really want to spend that much time with me anymore. They're both teenagers, so I suddenly have this time to train.
yeah,
And then you start to see, well, actually, now I can train consistently, regularly, build myself up.
yeah,
You might find that you're getting closer to what was your potential physiological
yeah,
peak in
yeah,
your 20s, but you're
yeah,
getting close to it in your 40s and 50s. And we see lots of people run marathon PBs in 40s and 50s.
yeah,
I think over the longer distances, it's more likely
yeah,
because top speed definitely declines as we get a bit
yeah,
older as
yeah,
well. So running a PB over, say, an 800 meters on the track, I
yeah,
think becomes a lot more challenging. But running a PB over a half marathon and a marathon is still
yeah.
very doable into your
Yeah,
40s
yeah.
and
So a lot
50s.
more about strategy, lifestyle factors, all sort of impacting upon ability to
Yeah,
run.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, which is obviously very reassuring for our older runners. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just going to ask you. You mentioned we talked about strength training, and that's really fantastic. Some excellent information there. Stretching. Now you talked about. You didn't put that in your list of most important factors, I don't think.
No.
What are your thoughts on stretching, particularly in older runners?
Yeah, I think probably the same as they are across the board. For me, stretching is a definitely useful tool, but not as useful as other tools. Essentially, it doesn't get backed up by the research, so the research doesn't really back it in terms of injury prevention or performance. Um, but we never research goes in cycles, so we
Hmm.
might be having a different conversation in 10 years. But at the moment the research suggests that it does produce transient and temporary improvements in flexibility,
Yeah,
or mobility around a joint, however you want to look at it. It can help with post-exercise soreness,
yeah,
post-exercise DOMS or muscle soreness, and so it has a potential role in recovery. It absolutely can be mentally part of someone's preparatory getting ready for a training session or a
hmm,
race. So for me, and I guess, yeah, we know we do get a little bit stiffer as we get a bit older. We our flexibility or mobility around our joints decreases. And if it decreases to a point where it perhaps is impeding your ability to maintain your stride length or
yeah,
something like that, there could absolutely be a role for doing some regular stretching.
yeah,
When people ask me, patients, running clients ask me, should I stretch? My answer is always the same. I say, do you find it useful? And if you find it useful, carry on with it.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. If you are time poor and you have to choose between stretching, strengthening, I'm always going to say choose strengthening.
yeah,
But if you've got that time and you
yeah,
want to invest that time in doing anything that might help you physically,
hmm,
absolutely dedicate a little bit of time to stretching around hips, knees, ankles,
yeah,
just maintaining a reasonable amount of
yeah,
flexibility. You could potentially maintain it through strength training through range is the
yeah.
other way to think of it. So
Okay,
it's one of those that I know it's a bit of a grey answer, but that's where I am with it. I'm
yeah,
sort
yeah,
of it's potentially useful, and if I would never tell someone to stop.
yeah,
I think if someone is finding it useful for them, absolutely carry on, because we can't confidently say it's doing any harm. Um, in fact, we definitely can't say it's doing any
yeah,
harm. And we can't confidently say it's detrimental to performance.
yeah,
So there's no reason to say stop it.
yeah,
It's just more, if you're needing to add things in, there's probably
yeah.
things I'd add in first.
Okay, great. Where would you, so I guess sort of just segue in across from stretching and range of movement and some of the things we've talked about there. Um, Gait analysis, so running gait analysis, where does that sit with you in terms of something that someone should seek to have looked at, or is there
Yeah.
changes that are likely to be beneficial?
Um, yeah, so it's a tricky one, I think. So you've got your shoe shop gait analysis
Yeah,
where you'll go in and they'll just film you from the mid shin down
yeah,
and give you an idea whether you need a neutral or a motion
yeah,
control shoe. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. I think we've moved away from pronation being a risk factor for injury for most.
sure, yeah,
So you don't necessarily need to control that pronation as much as we perhaps used
yeah,
to think. Pronation being the foot rolling
yeah,
in. So I think from a footwear perspective, I don't know if it adds loads of value. From injury prevention perspective, if you look at the latest systematic reviews, we really can't confidently say from looking at someone's gait whether they are at higher risk of injury.
yeah,
When you flip it round and you look at people who pick up injuries, we
yeah,
do see some things that seem to correlate with injury.
yeah,
Things like an overstride,
yeah,
which is the ankle landing out in front of the knee.
yeah,
Things like a very narrow gait, what we call a scissoring gait.
yeah,
Things like a large forward trunk lean
yeah,
seem to link with certain injuries.
yeah,
So I think it's an optional thing. You could absolutely choose to have your gait analyzed.
yeah,
One thing to bear in mind with it though is very difficult to change it. And
yeah,
especially someone who's run the same way for 30 or
yeah, yeah,
40 years, I think trying to change it. We do change it in people. We change it in the short term to move load around. If someone's say
uh-huh,
got a sore Achilles,
yeah,
we know that we can do some things. We know if we raise their heel in their shoe,
yeah,
take some of that load away from the Achilles, but it
yeah,
shifts it to the knee.
yeah,
We know if they increase their cadence a little bit,
yeah,
it takes a little bit of that
yeah, yeah.
that load away.
So by
Um,
cadence, you're talking about,
Steps per minute.
yeah,
So you can make temporary change. I think could be really useful,
yeah,
and I do think having the ability to know how to maybe just slightly adjust your
yeah,
running style while you're running, like a
yeah,
cadence
yeah,
change, can be really valuable just for varying loads.
yeah,
So absolutely, I do get analysis for people. I would probably say it is lower down on my things to change because
yeah,
it's harder to
yeah,
change.
yeah,
But for some people, it could potentially be
Yeah,
useful.
yeah,
And even from a running economy perspective, there was a recent study where they got coaches to look at runners on treadmills,
yeah,
and these are elite level coaches, and
yeah,
they could not rank in order 5 runners from who was the most economical to who was the least economical. So
yeah.
it's very hard to look at someone and say that's an economical running
Okay.
style.
Yeah,
Um, and if someone is doing that, they're very good at doing it,
yeah, yeah. So
basically.
quite subjective
It's
in
very
things. Yeah, yeah,
subjective. And
yeah,
like I said, and how you run is often ingrained over years and years
yeah,
and
yeah.
years. So challenging to
Yeah.
change,
So what
definitely.
I'm taking from that, and this is something that I've observed over the years, and that is, back in the day, people we said you must like land on your heel or you must land on this part of your foot. So they were giving very, very specific mechanical sort of changes, which then used to sort of throw the person out of kilter possibly. Whereas now it's sort of principle changes around things like increase engagement. And then that
Yeah.
person's natural running style almost sort of assimilates around those.
Yeah, I think using more like a cadence change, we usually use a metronome, and it's a beat, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
an external cue,
yeah,
and the body will naturally find a
yeah,
rhythm to that. Versus, like you said, if I tell someone who's a 4-foot striker to try
yeah,
and land on their heel, you can definitely pick out that that
yeah.
does not look
Yeah, yeah,
economical.
yeah, yeah.
It's
I
often
always say
looks,
to my patients, my running patients, it's like me trying to tell an introvert person to be extrovert or an extrovert person to be
yeah,
introvert. It's just not going to work.
it's very
Yeah,
challenging. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's very challenging.
You've got to go with that person's natural running style as much as possible and let
Yeah.
them assimilate that. So, just wanted to ask you, Alex, your opinion on. So, we've talked about running gait analysis. We've talked about the sort of shoe shop, trainer shop running gait analysis. What advice would you give a middle-aged runner when they're looking to go out and buy a pair of trainers?
Yeah, so I think number one is look at what you're currently running in,
Yeah,
and make sure you're not going to suddenly make a massive change.
yeah,
So if you are currently running in a shoe that's got what we call a high drop, so the difference in height between the back of the shoe
yeah,
and the front of the shoe, and that's say got a 12 millimeter difference, and then you suddenly put yourself in a 4 millimeter or zero drop
yeah,
shoe, that's going to drastically change loads. And particularly if you went that way, it would change loads on the calf, which is the area we talked about as being a
yeah,
high risk for injury. So get something that, at least in that particular element, is very similar to what you already had. So you're not making any drastic changes. After that, honestly, for me, I still go with comfort is king. If we are, so you want something relatively light, very comfortable. And if you do need something a bit more supportive, then it needs to provide that
yeah,
support as well. There's a huge array of shoes out there now, and obviously with carbon shoes and things like that, um, people are definitely wanting to get the current best thing out
yeah,
there. Um, but again, think about the type of running that you're doing. Carbon shoes are a performance shoe.
yeah,
And definitely, if you're looking at performance, shoes matter. But for someone just looking to build up their running and get some volume, you definitely don't need a carbon shoe. So
yeah,
I'd want a light, supportive shoe that you find very comfortable to wear.
yeah.
And I'd keep it that simple and make sure it isn't too drastically different to whatever you've been using for the previous 6 to 12 months.
Okay, so basically, the most comfortable ones are the best ones for you.
Yeah, why not? You're gonna
Yeah,
you're gonna
yeah,
run 2 3 hours a
yeah,
week in them. Yes, you might then have a racing shoe
yeah,
that you want,
yeah,
or a tempo shoe for running
yeah,
faster sessions in. That's
yeah,
fine. But for what you're gonna do the majority of your running in, I think it's gotta go.
yeah,
You
yeah,
gotta go with comfort
yeah.
first,
Great,
basically. Yeah.
fantastic. So, Alex, if we got a runner, and look, they basically want to go out running all the time. They don't want to go to a gym, but if they agree to go to a gym once or twice a week, and they're going to do just 3 or 4 exercises, what would be your go-to 3 or 4 exercises for these guys
Yeah.
to do?
So I think one will be obvious. One's
Yeah.
some form of calf raise. It's the
Okay.
most boring
Yeah.
exercise. It's not comfortable to do, but for the masters
Yeah.
runner, probably the most essential
Yeah. And you can always
exercise.
get on the calf raise machine because no one
Calf
uses
raise
it.
machine. Yeah, exactly. Smith. If you try and do calf raises
Yeah.
on the Smith machine, you
Yeah.
get some funny looks because
Yeah.
people want to squat on them. But if you were to pair up, so if we think of a second exercise, you could pair up a calf raise with a squat or a split squat.
Yeah.
I probably prefer a split squat just because of the slightly more unilateral demands of it.
Yeah.
Um, but you go with what you feel most competent at. So I'd have a calf raise, I'd have
Yeah.
a squat or a split squat,
Yeah.
and again build up your competency, which is why a Smith machine can be useful because
Yeah.
it gives you that stability. If you really don't like squatting, I would leg press instead, but I would
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
pushing exercise. I would then probably have some form of a side plank, which is maybe a bit of a left field one, but I think side plank gives you a load of trunk work
Yeah,
and some lateral hip work
yeah,
for so pelvic stability, which I
yeah,
think is really useful. So they would be my three strength
yeah.
exercises. And if I could shoehorn a fourth one in, I would probably have a form of jump, some form of
Excellent. Yeah, yeah,
exercise that works on power.
yeah,
That might be a box jump,
yeah,
might be what we call a drop jump where you drop off a low step and
yeah,
bounce. It would definitely be something you, if you're not used to jumping, you start small and
yeah,
build up. But I think working on power
yeah,
is really useful as well. So I'd
yeah,
have
yeah,
three strength exercises and a power
yeah.
exercise would
And
be.
with the calf strengthening exercises, do you get people to do bent knee and straight knee to get the
Yeah,
two?
I used to, and
Yeah.
then I think we've got good research now that shows us that Slash works really hard in a straight knee position.
Okay.
So if you're time poor, and again
Yeah,
you don't
yeah.
want to do too many, I would just do the straight knee.
Okay.
I think the bent knee doesn't work the gastrocnemius, the other
Yeah,
bit, as
yeah, yeah,
much. I generally, for rehab stuff I might go a bit different,
yeah,
but for general population, general runners, just a
yeah.
straight knee calf raise, absolutely fine.
We've talked mainly about sort of older runners, masters runners that have a history of running. So what I'd like to just think about now, somebody who's decided as they're sort of reaching master's age that they'd like to get into running, so haven't got a running history. What's a good, sensible, safe sort of plan for them
Yeah.
to start upon?
I think, I mean, there's loads of options out there.
Yeah,
Couch to 5K is very popular. I don't think Couch to 5K is aimed at a certain age group. It's probably aimed at a younger person,
yeah,
if I'm honest, looking at it. Um, so I think number one, you don't necessarily need to follow a strict plan, but I would have some basic principles. I'd be very patient with it. I would say to someone, don't focus on building up to a distance or anything like that. Just focus on slowly adding volume of your running each week. And I think it's very sensible to start with a walk run program because it will allow you to build cardiovascular health, cardiovascular fitness alongside musculoskeletal properties that need to change. So I would be saying, look, maybe only maximum, maybe 3 sessions a week, might even
hmm,
only be two. You might do two and a cycle ride. So you're working on some aerobic work, but it's not as much impact work. So you can vary it based on how you feel you're adapting and sort of recovering from these sessions. And I would simply start, maybe depending on fit, if they have a bit of fitness from something else, I might maybe start in week one and say, you know what, volume wise, you only need to maybe cover in each session a maximum of 5 to 10 minutes of running, but you might be out on your feet for half an hour. So I'd want them out of the house, loads of walking with some running intermixed with it. And the goal would be over a number of weeks and even months that every session might be 30 minutes,
yeah,
but the amount of that 30 minutes spent running will gradually increase, and the amount of it spent walking will naturally gradually decrease, which is what Couch to 5K essentially does. Um, and there's like Nike and Adidas and other people have their apps as well, and there's Garmin has an app that will help you with potentially if you want some a bit of structure to follow. But the key thing is, remember, those plans are generic, and so there's nothing wrong. Like the Couch to 5K, for example, is based on 3 runs a week. So it should take you 9 weeks to complete 27 runs. And in theory, you're at 5K. Um, there's nothing wrong with spacing that out over a longer period of time. There's nothing wrong with making that take 12 weeks and some weeks doing 2 runs, some weeks doing three, and just still following the protocol, but spacing it out a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with intermixing it with some cross training. So I think one thing to just bear in mind is everyone will progress differently. Listening to your body is a hard skill when you start running because we just want to do more and more and more. But listening to your body and
yeah,
saying, actually, the plan says this, but I don't quite feel ready for it today.
yeah,
So I might go to the gym and get in the pool for half an hour
yeah,
instead. And I'll come back to that run in a day or two
yeah,
and
yeah,
take it on then. So the key thing I would say is be patient. Bone, muscle, tendon adapts very slowly. If
yeah,
you've been sedentary, any form of running is going to be a shock to your system,
yeah,
and you need to just take your time to allow
yeah,
your body to adapt to
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
basically. I would have no problem with someone taking 6 months to build up to that 5K, because if they're
Right.
just starting running now, I want them to be able to run for another 10 to 20 years.
Yeah,
So if it takes them a year to get to 5K, it doesn't matter, because
yeah,
then they've got another 19 years
for sure.
to
Yeah,
build
yeah,
themselves up,
yeah.
basically.
So
So
start low, build slow, and
yeah,
think of
start
the
low, build slow is a
yeah,
great little
yeah, yeah, yeah,
catchy logo to give,
yeah, yeah,
actually. And yeah, and be adaptable. Don't
yeah,
feel like you need to stick to a really rigid structure.
yeah,
Just listen
Yeah.
to your body
Yeah.
and adapt, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. I mean, that has been amazingly interesting, insightful, and therapeutic in equal measure, Alex Quinn. So thank you very much for that.
No, pleasure. Thanks very much.